Sarah had just moved into the old apartment building on the corner of Wexler Street. It wasn't the prettiest place, but the price was right, and she needed a fresh start. The building had seen better days. The hallways smelled faintly of mildew, the wallpaper peeled at the edges, and the elevator creaked ominously. On her first day, she noticed how quiet it was. No sounds of televisions, music, or conversations leaked from the other units. Even the usual hum of city life outside seemed muted. Sarah had always found her new apartment building peculiar. It wasn't the creaky elevator or the faint smell of mildew lingering in the halls. It was the silence. The kind that seemed unnatural, almost oppressive. Of all the neighbors, only one caught her attention. The woman in 2B. She passed her neighbor's door, 2B, and noticed it was slightly ajar. For a moment she hesitated, expecting someone to step out, but the shadowed room remained still. Shrugging it off, she carried on with unpacking. Later that evening, Sarah heard footsteps in the hallway. She peeked out and saw her neighbor for the first time, a slender woman with pale skin and dark hair. She wore a long scarf draped loosely around her neck and carried herself as though the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. "Hi," Sarah said with a friendly smile. The woman stopped, hesitated, then nodded slightly. Her eyes were shadowed, as if she hadn't slept in days. "You're in 2B?" Sarah asked. "Yes," the woman replied softly, her voice almost too faint to hear. "You just moved in?" Sarah nodded. "I'm Sarah. Nice to meet you." The woman glanced down the hall nervously. "I'm Evelyn. Be careful here." Before Sarah could ask what she meant, Evelyn slipped into her apartment, closing the door quietly behind her. In the following days, Sarah would occasionally see Evelyn. Each time, Evelyn's demeanor was the same, quiet, reserved, and almost fearful. One evening, as Sarah returned from work, Evelyn was standing in the hallway, staring at her own door. "Evelyn?" Sarah asked, approaching cautiously. "She's here," Evelyn whispered, not turning around. "Who's here?" "The woman who watches, the one who followed me home." Evelyn's voice cracked, and Sarah felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Do you need help?" Sarah offered. Evelyn finally turned to face her, tears in her eyes. "You wouldn't understand. Just don't linger in the halls after dark." Evelyn's warnings unsettled Sarah, but she tried to brush them off. Still, she couldn't shake the unease that settled over her. One night, she decided to dig into the building's history. What she found was disturbing. A series of unexplained incidents had occurred in the building over the years. Residents disappearing, reports of strange noises, and one unsolved murder. Evelyn Walker, the tenant of 2B, found strangled in her apartment 10 years ago. Her photo in the article was unmistakable. It was the same woman Sarah had been speaking to. The next day, Sarah knocked on Evelyn's door. After a long pause, it creaked open. Evelyn stood there, her scarf tightly wound around her neck. "I know," Sarah blurted out. "I read about what happened to you." Evelyn's expression softened. "You're the first to believe me." She stepped aside, motioning for Sarah to enter. The apartment was cold, far colder than it should have been. Sarah noticed the rocking chair in the corner, gently moving despite the still air. "Why are you still here?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I can't leave," Evelyn said. "Not until someone knows the truth." She began to tell her story. How she had been followed home one night. How she had sensed someone watching her for weeks before the attack. How, on the night of her murder, she had heard footsteps in the hallway. But when she opened the door, no one was there. "I screamed," Evelyn whispered, her voice breaking. But no one came. The next morning, Sarah went straight to the landlord's office. "There's something wrong with this building," she said. "Evelyn." The landlord held up a hand. "Evelyn? The woman from 2B?" He frowned. "That apartment's been vacant for years. After what happened, no one would take it." Sarah's blood ran cold. "But I've been talking to her. She's there." The landlord leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I don't know what to tell you, miss. That apartment's been locked up since the police finished their investigation. No one's lived there since." Determined to prove she wasn't imagining things, Sarah returned to 2B. She pushed the door open and found the apartment exactly as she'd seen it before, cold and sparse. "Evelyn?" she called. The rocking chair creaked. Slowly, Evelyn appeared from the shadows, her scarf trailing behind her like a ghostly ribbon. "I just wanted someone to listen," she said, her voice softer than ever. "You've done that for me." Before Sarah could respond, Evelyn began to fade, her form dissolving like mist in the pale moonlight. That night, Sarah woke to a strange feeling of peace. She glanced at her window and saw Evelyn one last time, her silhouette bathed in moonlight. But when she blinked, Evelyn was gone. In the morning, Sarah found a single note slipped under her door. It read, "You freed me." From that day on, the building felt different, warmer, lighter. But Sarah never forgot the chilling tale of the vanishing neighbor. The building felt different after that, warmer, brighter. Sarah stayed for a while but eventually moved on, unable to shake the memory of the vanishing neighbor and the chilling truth she'd uncovered. Before she moved out, Sarah decided to visit 2B one last time. The door was unlocked, the landlord having failed to re-secure it after their visit. Inside, the room was colder than she remembered, the rocking chair in its usual corner. But now, something was different. On the floor beneath the chair lay Evelyn's scarf, neatly folded. Sarah knelt down, hesitant, and picked it up. The fabric was soft, but cold, and as she held it, she heard the faintest whisper. "Thank you for listening." The chair creaked behind her, though no one sat in it. Sarah didn't look back. She placed the scarf on the chair and left the apartment for good, closing the door softly behind her. Even now, she sometimes hears the faint creak of a rocking chair and wonders if Evelyn truly found peace, or if she's still out there, waiting to be heard. Sarah moved out a week later, but she could never fully escape what had happened. Sometimes she dreamed of Evelyn, standing in the hallway, her scarf trailing behind her. Years passed, and the building fell into further disrepair. It was eventually condemned and torn down. On the day of its demolition, Sarah stood across the street, watching the walls crumble into dust. For a moment, as the wrecking ball struck, she thought she saw a figure in one of the windows, a woman with a scarf, smiling faintly before disappearing into the rubble. Though Evelyn was gone, her story remained with Sarah. She became an advocate for cold cases, dedicating her time to giving voices to the forgotten and the silenced. In her heart, she knew Evelyn had inspired her. Even so, when Sarah lay awake at night, the shadows in her room often felt too long, the air too cold. And sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she swore she could hear the faint creak of a rocking chair in the distance, as if Evelyn was still watching, grateful for the truth finally being heard. The snow fell in thick, muffling sheets, blanketing the forest in an unnatural quiet. The Callahan family's SUV crunched up the long, icy driveway, the headlights slicing through the dense gloom. Ahead, the cabin loomed, a shadowy silhouette against the stark white backdrop, its windows like hollow eyes staring into the cold. They were seeking a Christmas retreat, a chance to escape the noise of the city and reconnect. But as they stepped through the creaking door, a biting chill seeped into their bones, a cold far deeper than the winter air. None of them noticed the faint, bloody handprint smeared on the inside of the frosted window. The cabin stood deep in the heart of the forest, a relic of the 1800s with its weathered wooden walls and frost-bitten windows. It was nestled against a frozen lake, the surrounding trees gnarled and skeletal against the pale winter sky. For the Callahan family, it seemed perfect, secluded, serene, and untouched by time. The father, Mark, unloaded the luggage, while his wife, Lisa, ushered their two children, 10-year-old Emily and her teenage brother, Sam, inside. The air smelled of pine and ice. Inside, the cabin was quaint but cold, with a stone fireplace, heavy wooden furniture, and a faint, inexplicable scent of decay that Mark dismissed as old wood. By nightfall, the cabin had warmed up, the crackling fire spreading an orange glow across the living room. The family laughed and played board games as snow piled outside, sealing them off from the world. But the laughter was interrupted when Emily gasped, clutching her ears. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. The family paused, listening. Nothing but the wind. "Just the wind, sweetheart," Lisa reassured her. But as the night wore on, the whispers became harder to ignore. They seemed to seep from the very walls, faint voices murmuring in unison, their tone mournful. Sam, ever the skeptic, pressed his ear to the wall. "It's probably the pipes," he said, though his voice betrayed unease. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only the creak of settling wood. The following day, Sam explored the attic. He returned with a faded leather-bound diary he found tucked under a loose floorboard. It belonged to Margaret Holloway, who had lived in the cabin with her family over a century ago. The entries began cheerfully, describing snowy days and family dinners. But the final pages were frantic, written in trembling handwriting. "They are coming. They want us to join them." Mark dismissed it as a spooky tale, but Lisa couldn't shake the unease. That night, as the family slept, Emily woke up screaming. She claimed to see shadows moving in her room, their shapes flickering against the walls like distorted marionettes. When Lisa rushed in, the window was wide open, snow blowing inside, though they were certain it had been locked. The whispers grew louder the following night, no longer mournful, but angry. The family discovered bloody handprints on the windows and door frames, as if something had tried to claw its way inside. Sam found an old, rusted knife in the cellar with dried blood still encrusting the blade. Lisa called the police, but the line was dead. The car wouldn't start, and the snowstorm had made leaving on foot impossible. That night, they saw them, the Holloways. The family appeared as translucent figures in period clothing, their faces pale and bloodied. They stood in the living room, motionless except for their eyes, which stared directly at the Callahans. When Mark tried to speak to them, the figures lunged forward with unnatural speed before vanishing into the walls. The Callahans pieced together the story. The Holloways had been murdered by their deranged father on Christmas Eve, their blood staining the snow outside the cabin. Their spirits were trapped, reliving their final moments endlessly. Emily, drawn to the attic one night, found a small wooden doll smeared with blood. "They don't want to hurt us," she whispered in a trance. "They just want to share." Lisa pulled her away, but the cabin was no longer just a structure. It breathed, groaned, and thrummed with energy, locking them inside. The walls bled sap-like fluid, and the windows reflected not their faces, but those of the Holloways. Christmas Eve arrived. The Callahans decided to confront the spirits, gathering in the living room with candles and the rusted knife. They recited prayers and demanded the Holloways release them. The ghosts appeared again, but this time, their movements were violent and erratic. Objects flew across the room. The fire turned an unnatural blue. The cabin itself seemed to warp, the walls elongating and folding inward. The Holloways screamed in unison, a piercing sound that rattled bones. In the chaos, Emily vanished, her voice echoing from the attic. Mark and Lisa found her standing in the corner, her eyes vacant. "They say we can stay," she whispered, "forever." By Christmas morning, the Callahans were gone. The cabin stood silent and untouched, as if no one had ever been there. Days later, another family arrived, drawn by the promise of a quaint holiday getaway. The cycle began anew. Weeks later, the cabin sat untouched, silent beneath a heavy blanket of snow. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying faint echoes of laughter and screams, entwined like a twisted melody. Inside, the air was still, the fireplace cold, yet the faint outline of footsteps, small and large, trailed across the dusty floor, leading nowhere. A single tiny wooden doll sat upright in the center of the room, its painted eyes staring blankly at the door. Far off in the distance, the crunch of tires on fresh snow broke the silence. Another family had arrived. The cabin waited. The Callahans were absorbed into the cycle of the cabin, their identities dissolved into the fabric of its curse. Mark, Lisa, Sam, and Emily became part of the Holloway's eternal torment, their spirits bound to relive that cursed Christmas night over and over. Each of them took on roles in the grim tableau. Mark became a shadow in the walls, his anguished cries blending with the whispers that haunted the cabin. Lisa's spectral form wandered aimlessly, clutching at phantom doors that would never open. Sam's laughter echoed unnaturally in empty rooms, distorted into a chilling mockery. Emily, the youngest and most innocent, stood forever at the attic window, her face a pale reflection in the frost, her tiny hand pressed against the glass. She watched, waiting, as new families arrived to play their part in the cabin's endless horror. They didn't simply disappear, they became forgotten, erased from the world outside, their existence remembered only by the cursed cabin itself.